Carlos Alcaraz walked into the Indian Wells press room on Tuesday, and the first question was about tennis. His draw for the Indian Wells, his current form, and his unprecedented start to the year. But then came the second question. A journalist asked him about what had been happening in the Middle East, and the room shifted in the way rooms shift when a topic arrives that is genuinely bigger than the event everyone is gathered to cover. Alcaraz paused and then said something that will make every tennis fan emotional. He said something that reminded everyone about the fact that he had actually been there not too long ago and playing under the insecurity, and that what he felt about it comes from his heart. Before we get into what Alcaraz said, I need you to understand the timeline of events that brought the tennis world to one of the most amazing moments in the sport's recent history. The ATP Tour's Middle East hardcourt swing, a stretch of events in Doha, Abu Dhabi, and Dubai that has become a fixture on the calendar since the Gulf states began investing heavily in professional sport. Concluded in the final days of February 2026. Alcaraz had been in Doha just days before the situation escalated, winning the Qatar Open as part of a 12-match unbeaten run that had carried him from the Australian Open title through to the early weeks of the North American season. He won in Doha, packed up, and flew west toward California and the Indian Wells Desert. Coincidentally or not, what he left behind, within days, became a conflict zone. The sequence of events moved with the disorienting speed that geopolitical crises always seem to move with when they arrive without warning. Then we will have the back and forth between the nations involved, making the players extremely worried about how to leave. In Dubai's five-star hotel rooms, a group of professional tennis players who had been playing tournament matches 48 hours earlier found themselves stranded, watching the news, waiting for phones to work, and trying to figure out how they were going to get out of a city that had suddenly, overnight, become a different kind of place from the one they had competed in the previous week. Daniil Medvedev had just won the Dubai Championships. He was supposed to be heading to Indian Wells as a tournament winner, one of the form players on the ATP Tour, with momentum and confidence and a seated place in the draw, waiting for him in California. Instead, he was in his hotel room in Dubai, telling reporters through a media contact that the airspace was closed and nobody knew when it would reopen. Andrei Rublev, who had reached the Dubai semifinals and was also due in Indian Wells, was in the same situation. Karen Khachanov, doubles finalists Hari Heliovara, Henry Patton, Marcelo Arevalo, and Mate Pavic, coaching teams, journalists, over 40 people connected to the ATP Tour found themselves in a holding pattern in a city that was hearing explosions and watching its skies close. The ATP released a formal statement making clear that player welfare was the organization's priority and that they were in direct communication with affected players and monitoring the situation. Tournament organizers in Dubai extended hotel accommodations by 3 days to ease the immediate logistical burden. The ATP explored alternative travel routes, a 6-hour drive to Oman, a 10-hour drive to Riyadh through border crossings. But the risks involved meant most players initially chose to wait rather than attempt overland escapes through a region in active conflict. Private jets, road trips through the Gulf Desert, emergency meetings convened on Sunday evening. The logistics of getting professional tennis players out of a war zone had become, briefly and surreally, the leading story of the Indian Wells week. Medvedev and Rublev eventually managed to get out via Oman, boarding a private jet that took them out of the immediate conflict zone before connecting flights carried them to Los Angeles. They were racing the clock. As seeded players, their first-round byes meant they had until the second round to arrive, buying them slightly more time than the unseeded players who needed to be courtside from the tournament's opening day. Reports emerged that they had managed to depart. Their status for the singles draw, initially deeply uncertain, began to look more manageable. The story that had threatened to overshadow the entire tournament, the spectacle of top 10 players unable to reach a Masters 1000 because of a conflict they had no part in and no warning of, began cautiously to move toward resolution. But the players who had already made it to Indian Wells, the ones who had left the Middle East before the airspace closed, who had been in Doha or had gone directly from home, carried the weight of what their colleagues were going through into every press conference they sat down at in the California desert. And nobody carried it quite as visibly, quite as honestly as Carlos Alcaraz. He had been in Doha and had won the Qatar Open on the same hard courts where a week later the region erupted. He sat in front of the press at Indian Wells and was asked directly about the situation, and his answer was neither a press conference response, nor was it managed or reduced to the kind of diplomatic non-answer that public figures tend to reach for when the subject is sensitive and the cameras are on. It was surprising, because a couple of days or 1 week before, we are all playing there. It has worried me a little. That is the quote. Simple, direct, no political positioning and no attempt to turn a personal feeling into a statement. He said he was surprised, because the proximity was real and the timeline was jarring. He had been playing professional tennis in that region 1 week before missiles were landing there. The normalcy of a tennis tournament, the routine of practice sessions and warm-ups and press conferences and trophy ceremonies had been replaced within days by something that bore no resemblance to any of it. And his reaction to that jarring transition was not a talking point. It was a person saying honestly that it had worried him. It is worth sitting with that honesty for a moment, because it is rarer than it should be. The culture of professional sport press conferences tends to produce a particular kind of language, carefully calibrated, minimally revealing, designed to inform without exposing anything that could be taken out of context or turned into a headline that the athlete or their team didn't intend. Players are media trained from early in their careers to navigate these moments. The bigger the player, the more sophisticated the training, the smoother the deflection. Alcaraz, at 22, is already one of the most experienced press conference operators on the ATP Tour. He has been doing this since he was a teenager, has faced every kind of question imaginable, and has generally handled the media environment with a maturity and a warmth that belies his age. And yet, despite all of that experience, despite having sat in more press rooms than most players twice his age, he has never quite become the polished, guarded version of a world number one that the role might be expected to produce. That is not an accident. It is a consistent pattern that runs through everything he does publicly, and it starts with his family. He has spoken about his father, Carlos Alcaraz Sr., and his grandfather, who first introduced him to tennis in El Palmar as a young child, in terms that make clear their influence is not just biographical background, but an active daily presence in how he sees the world. He has spoken about his friends at home, the people who knew him before any of this, who keep him anchored to a version of himself that has nothing to do with world rankings or Grand Slam trophies. He has spoken about his coach Juan Carlos Ferrero and the nature of that relationship in ways that go well beyond the technical, the shared history, the trust built over years, the sense of a mentor who has been through the peaks and troughs of a high-level tennis career himself, and who brings that lived experience to every conversation. These are the relationships that produce someone who, when asked about missiles landing near where they played tennis a week ago, says plainly that it worried them, rather than reaching for the managed response. But what you occasionally see from Alcaraz, in moments that catch him slightly off guard or touch something genuine, is the person underneath the media profile. The young man from El Palmar who grew up in a close family, who has spoken openly about the mental difficulty of his early career, who cried at Wimbledon when he won his second title there and then couldn't quite explain why. The one who said after his first-round U.S. Open loss in 2024 that he felt he had taken steps backwards mentally and didn't know why. Not a prepared answer, not a deflection, just a person sitting in front of cameras and admitting that something inside him wasn't working and he didn't have the explanation for it yet. The one who, in the middle of the most dominant start to a season in his career, still finds time to laugh at a courtside fan's sign during a tournament match and let it go viral because the reaction was completely unforced. That is the Alcaraz who showed up in the Indian Wells press room on Tuesday. Not the world number one managing a media moment, a young man saying plainly that something genuinely worried him. He was not alone in feeling it. Jannik Sinner, speaking at his own press conference, spoke about the situation with the measured empathy that has characterized his public statements on anything beyond tennis. He said he hoped everyone was safe and could either reach Indian Wells or get home to their families. He acknowledged that there are scenarios in life that tennis players cannot control, and that when those scenarios arrive, they make you realize very quickly that there are things considerably more important than any match score. It was a typically Sinner response, precise, considered, emotionally aware, without being emotionally performed. Coco Gauff, the top-ranked American women's player, called it unfortunate and said her thoughts were with everyone affected. Jack Draper, who had been in Dubai the previous week and left just in time, he described himself as having been among the last players to get out before the situation escalated, told reporters he felt fortunate to have left when he did. That word, fortunate, carries weight when you sit with it. He was playing professional tennis in Dubai 7 days ago. The difference between his situation and Medvedev's was a matter of days on a flight booking. These are young people, in their early to mid-20s, navigating a world that professional tennis does not typically prepare them for. The tour is a bubble in the most literal sense, a self-contained traveling world with its own rhythms and rituals and hierarchies, insulated from most of the ordinary complications of life by logistics teams, hotel rooms, tournament cars, and practice courts. The athletes who travel it every year get very good at the specific demands of that world. What they don't get training for is what happens when the world outside the bubble intrudes in the way it intruded this week, when the question in the press room is not about a backhand or a fitness decision or a draw position, but about missiles and closed airspace and colleagues stranded in a conflict zone. And the responses you saw from Alcaraz, Sinner, Gauff, and Draper this week, different in tone and specificity, but consistent in their basic humanity, were the responses of people who hadn't rehearsed for this particular question and answered it from wherever they actually were emotionally. That authenticity, in a media environment that usually produces something more polished, was itself notable. The fact that Alcaraz answered it the way he did, without deflecting, without reducing it to a generic expression of concern, without making it about anything other than what it actually was, is not a small thing. He said it surprised him. He said it worried him. He noted the specific, disorienting detail of the proximity, a couple of days or 1 week before they had all been playing there. That detail is the heart of it. The tennis court in Doha, the practice facility, the hotel lobby, the restaurant where players eat between matches, all of it was in the same part of the world that was now under fire. The normalcy and the chaos were separated by nothing more than a week and a few hundred miles. The conversation also threw into relief something about the ATP Tour's relationship with the Gulf states that has been discussed in various quarters of the tennis media for several years, and that this week made suddenly, unavoidably vivid. The Tour's Middle East swing has grown significantly in commercial importance. The prize money, the facilities, the spectacle of world-class tennis in cities that were barely on the sports radar a decade ago have made the Gulf events genuinely attractive to players and organizations alike. Alcaraz won the Qatar Open last week. Medvedev won in Dubai. Rublev went deep. The results, the tennis, the production values, all of it was excellent by any objective measure. And then, within days of the final trophy ceremony, the region where all of it had taken place became a conflict zone that the same players were being asked to comment on from the safe distance of a California press conference. The physical reality of what Medvedev, Rublev, and the 40-plus other people stranded in Dubai actually experienced has not been fully told yet, because most of them were trying to get out of it rather than document it. What we know is this. They woke up in hotel rooms on Saturday morning to news of missile strikes. They discovered that the airport was closed. They learned that there were no flights, no timeline, and no clear plan for when any of that would change. They were in a foreign country, in a region at war, with their families watching from home and no certainty about the route back. The ATP offered alternatives, the 6-hour road trip to Oman, the 10-hour drive to Riyadh, that most players initially refused because the risks involved in driving through an active conflict zone felt greater than the risk of waiting. Medvedev and Rublev eventually devised a private jet plan through Oman that eventually got them out, reportedly through Turkey or Armenia, before connecting to Los Angeles. That is not a normal week on the professional tennis circuit. That is a crisis, managed by a group of athletes and their teams with the resources and the support structures of a global sport behind them. But a crisis nonetheless. Nobody is making a simple argument about the rights and wrongs of the tour's presence in those markets. The geopolitical situation is complicated, and the decisions that led to this specific crisis were made by governments, not tennis organizations. But the proximity of it, the specific fact of players having been there, and then having to watch colleagues trapped there while sitting in the Californian desert preparing for a tennis tournament, is not something the sport can entirely insulate itself from. Alcaraz, characteristically, did not try to insulate himself from it. He said he was worried. And in the environment of an Indian Wells press room, with all of its ordinary tennis questions and draw predictions and ranking implications, that was the most human thing anyone said all week. He will play his matches. He will navigate the draw that has Djokovic in his half and a projected Sinner final waiting at the end of it. He will do the things that world number ones do at tournaments. Give press conferences, sign autographs, hit shots that make thousands of people in Stadium 1 turn to each other and try to figure out what they just saw. The tennis will proceed and the story of the tournament will be written by the results on the court. But Tuesday in the Indian Wells press room was a reminder of something that the relentless forward motion of the professional sports calendar tends to obscure. The players competing in Indian Wells this week are not symbols or products or content generators, though the industry around them occasionally treats them as all three. They are people who travel to unfamiliar countries, play in cities they have visited perhaps once or twice in their lives, build routines in environments that change every week, and occasionally wake up to news that their most recent professional assignment was taking place in a region that is now at war. They carry that with them into the press conferences and onto the practice courts, and into the locker rooms where nobody has a camera. And some of them, the ones built the way Alcaraz is built, with whatever combination of family, culture, temperament, and upbringing produces someone who defaults to honesty, say so when asked. There is also something worth noting about what Alcaraz did not do with his answer. He did not use it as a platform. He did not make a political statement. He did not position himself as a spokesperson for anything beyond his own immediate personal reaction to the situation. He did not tell anyone what to think or what the right response to the conflict was, or who was right and who was wrong. He said he was surprised, because the proximity to his own recent experience was striking. He said it had worried him. And then he moved on to the tennis questions. That restraint, the choice to be honest without being political, to acknowledge without moralizing, is itself a kind of maturity that sits alongside everything else about him that tends to get overshadowed by the brilliance of what he does with a racket in his hand. The tennis is extraordinary, but the person is quietly worth paying attention to as well. The broader conversation about what professional sport owes to the world beyond its own boundaries is one that has no tidy resolution, and that different people will answer very differently depending on what they believe athletes are for. Some think sport should be an escape from the complexity of the world, a place where the only thing that matters is who wins the next point, and the only context anyone needs is the current score. Some think athletes, given their platforms and their reach and their visibility, have responsibilities that extend beyond the performance itself, that the audience listening to a world number one in a press conference is an audience that deserves more than talking points about forehand technique. Most people sit somewhere between these two positions, depending on the day and the subject and the athlete. What is not really debatable is the simple fact of what happened this week. Alcaraz was in Doha a week ago, competing in a professional tennis tournament. The region went to war within days of his departure. His colleagues were stranded in a hotel in Dubai, watching news channels and trying to figure out overland routes through a conflict zone to get to a tennis tournament in California. He sat in a press room in the desert and told the truth about how he felt about it. Not a media truth, a real one. That is the whole story, and it is, in its quiet way, one of the better things that happened at Indian Wells this week. He said he was worried. For a world number one, at the start of what may be the most dominant season of his career, sitting in the most glamorous tennis tournament outside of the Grand Slams, that was a remarkable thing to say. And the fact that it came so naturally, without calculation, without pause, that is the part worth remembering. And here we have our video. If this one made you think about something beyond the sport, that was the intention. Drop a comment. Do you think tennis players have a responsibility to speak up about world events, or should they stay in their lane? I want to hear your view on both sides. Subscribe if you haven't already. There's a lot more coming throughout Indian Wells and beyond.